I forgot. I don't have use for a hairdryer these days, so I forgot to bring one. John's going to be so kind to get me. I do need one because I work very wet, at least at the beginning, and then I like to have everything nice and dry as I go forward. It never fails to amaze me when I go out on probably the nicest day of the year at the beginning of the summer, and I go to a park and I just see droves of landscape painters everywhere. And yet when the weather turns a little funny and I go to the park, I see nobody out, you know. And I always think that I learned a lot on gray days and bad weather days. And I see some of the most amazing effects that produce some of the most amazing pictures. My friend, I have a friend, John Osborne. He's an oil painter. He was my teacher, my best friend to this day. And John is always fond of saying, I made a career of a gray day, and he really did, And likewise, I made a career out of a foggy day. I had a show many years ago, a one-man show by where I teach. Is that better when I talk down? Maybe I should lower this a little bit. And I had this one-man show. That's not better.
No, that's good.
Is it good? And I had a whole bunch of variety of different paintings, different kinds of light effects. But there was one picture. It was this foggy harbor, and I didn't think anything of it. It went so fast. It was one of those pictures that you do in just a short amount of time. It was a full sheet. It was really nice. It turned out pretty well. I could have probably I did sell that painting. I could have probably sold it 10 times that day. That's how people were interested in that one particular picture. And then it just seems every show I had, the first thing that would go would be something foggy, and who would have thought? But these days, these funny weather days, gray days, really do produce some amazing things. And as a student, it's kind of important to get out on a gray day because it's a little easier to paint a gray day than it is a sunny day. Think about it. You go out at 6 in the morning, and by 8 in the morning, the light is completely changed. You may get a partly cloudy day by 7 o'clock. The scene is complete. It's very frustrating. I've seen people want to just take their easel and throw it into the stream. But on a gray day, the weather is the same from start to finish. You can really learn a lot about shape making. You can learn a lot about color mixing on overcast days. And of course, you might see the sky open up and a spotlight hits one part of the landscape, and wow, you've got a Frederick Church amazing, Hudson River School landscape, beautiful, a beautiful effect. Earlier this summer, my wife and I took a trip to Scotland, and we started out in Edinburgh. I met some old friends, an old student of mine, and we caught up with them in Edinburgh. And it was our 30th wedding anniversary, but my wife is a very good travel companion for an artist. She can occupy herself while I paint, so it's a good thing. I understand that's not always the case with spouses, but I painted everywhere we went. I came home, it was a 2-week trip. I came home with about 14 different kinds of pictures in different stages. This is one from Pittenweem. Here's another sketch from Kouros. This is Edinburgh. And I work up my sketches to a degree. I hang on to my sketches that I do outdoors. Out of a picture like this, I could get several finished paintings. I know there are a lot of plein air painters that like to go to the spot, finish what they do on the spot, put it in a frame, and sell it. My sketches are very valuable to me, and I hang on to them. They often provide the source for not just one picture, but for multiple. On a particular day, I could have taken that sky that I did on that day and used it in another picture, or it jars my memory of what I got to do when I paint an area that's similar. Here's another picture of, I was in Greece last year this time. It We were on Santorini, and so these are the kinds of sketches that I do on location. You can see that they're not completely finished, but they're worked up enough. And they're worked up enough, and from several of these pictures, I have had finished paintings, and usually I work a larger, a full-size sheet, or I work at the same size, but I hang on to these sketches. They're really valuable to me. When we were in Scotland, we went from Edinburgh to Inverness. We went up to Skye, and then from Skye we wound up in, the last leg of our trip was in the Firth of Forth, which is an estuary that runs above Edinburgh, and there are a string of little fishing villages. I probably could have spent the entire trip in that area. It was so very beautiful. All the homes and the villages go back centuries, and they're just one beautiful village after the next. We stayed in a place called Pittenweem, and from there went to St. Monans, Cwros. If you're a fan of Outlander, I don't know if you've seen it. They did a lot of filming in Cwros, which is a 1600s village. Really kind of a cool place. When we were in Portree, which is in Skye, we had a great host for our bed and breakfast, and he gave us a whole bunch of great places to kind of visit. One was called Plockton, and we were there just for an afternoon. It was drizzly. I couldn't paint it. I wish I could have. I did take some pictures, and that's the picture I'm going to do for you this afternoon. It was a rainy day, drizzly on and off. It was low tide. I love low tide. I just love the. I was in one of the places that I was painting. In fact, it was Pittenweem, and it was low tide. And there was a couple from America that had saw me painting and was wondering why I was painting at low tide. But it's funny. People's different sensibilities are. But this scene's really cool. The sky begins to open up, and there's some fog lifting off the mountains. When I was there, I wasn't even aware that there were some mountains beyond the harbor. And then as the fog kind of separated a little bit, it was lifting off. It's great for a watercolor effect. So with that, let's get started. When I go on location, I just want to show you something. Oh, you got my hairdryer? No. Yeah. Oh, great. Awesome. Oh, great. Awesome. Whenever I go on location, I cut these little rectangles out, and I have them for different sizes of paper that I use. And when I've used something like this my entire career. When I'm outdoors, I close one eye and I look at the scene going in, and I can kind of tell which way the composition works best. And I use this for the first 5 minutes of my drawing. And then I put it away and never use it again. But it helps me to really find a composition outdoors. And I always start out by wetting the entire sheet. And I'm always aware of, I try to be aware of how wet the paper is. You never give much thought to it. I had an art teacher in high school who the adage was, you could work the paper when it's completely wet or completely dry and never in between. Here's I'll go. And never in between. But how wrong I've discovered that adage is. There are different stages of wetness to a sheet of paper. 3 actually, and it's saturated, which is what I'm doing right now. The paper's so wet that we can see a shine on it. And in a few minutes after it's wet like that, the paper becomes the second stage of wetness, when the shine just begins to disappear, moist. And you can do certain effects with that kind of a sheet. And then finally, the last stage of wetness is damp, which is really not a lot you can do with that. I don't think there's a lot that you can do with that stage. I'm more interested in the saturated and moist for my effects in my landscape. So it's soaking wet. I know it because I can see a shine on the paper. It's an overcast day, so I'm not going to use a warm color for my clouds. The clouds have color. There is a white, although it's going to be a big bank of white clouds, there is some color to the white parts. And it's not necessarily cool. It can be, on a sunny day, we would use warm colors for the whites of the clouds. But on an overcast day, I prefer to have a little bit of pink in it, and I use cadmium red medium, or even up to alizarin, colors that are considered to be a violet, on the violet end of the spectrum. So here's some cadmium red medium, and I'm going to take some of that color. Whoops. You know, pour some of that on there. A lot of this is going to get. It never fails to elicit a response whenever I do that. And you know, I'm in no panic right now because the paper is soaking wet. And I'm going to take a little bit of Payne's Gray that I mix. I don't buy Payne's Gray. I have Ivory Black on my palette, but I don't mix my Payne's Gray. And I'm going to, it's just Cobalt Blue and Ivory Black. And I'm just going to pour some of that on here. And this color is just to resolve my whites. I want some color in my white areas of my picture. And I really want to put the brush away.
Joel, could you move the bottom edge closer? Thank you. Is that okay?
Yep. Don't tell me how to paint, John. So I'm rolling it around, and you can see that I mean, there's color on here. And remember, color always looks darker in value, and it always looks more rich in color when it's wet. When it dries, that red is going to settle down. And I'm not done with the sky yet. I'm far from it. I'm going to work some other values into it. I'm going to work some clouds into the scene. But this resolves my whites. This is going to, in the end, this is going to be the lightest part of my scene. I also have some houses down here, and there's also a lake, and I want to get some color into those two things as well. And again, I want it to be Payne's Gray.
Is that 140-pound paper?
Yeah, no, it's 300.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was wondering why.
No, I used to, when I was after I graduated from college, I worked for one of my professors who was an artist. He was his name is Jim McMullen. He's an illustrator. He was the principal illustrator for Lincoln Center Theater. He would do all their theater posters, and he did a lot of theater stuff over the years. And I had a stretch paper for Jim. I would take, every Monday morning when I came into work, I had to do about 14, he used to use 90-pound paper. I had to soak it in cold water for like an hour, and then I took each sheet out and I had to stretch it onto a board, like a drawing board. And I did that every Monday morning for about 3 years, and I swore when I stopped working for him I would never do that again. And I haven't. But I did enjoy working on those sheets. They were really an amazing surface to work on. It was 90-pound paper. And you know, if you've ever used lightweight paper, how bad it'll buckle, right? And you'll get valleys, hills and valleys. 300-pound paper, you can see how wet it is. This paper's soaking wet, and you can see it's relatively flat. There's not a wrinkle in it, you know. But if you think of this is 140, and I work large. I work. I do a lot of double elephant, which is the next size up, so 30, 40, and even 40, 60. When you start to get big like that, you can't do a 140-pound sheet. You know, you're going to have that kind of an effect. And whenever there's a valley, the valley will dry darker. Wherever there's a hill, you know, it'll dry a little lighter. You can actually see the waves in it when it dries. But the 300-pound paper is nice in that it doesn't do that. Now I have a lake down here, and I have some white houses. And if you know, if you look at my photo reference, you know, the white houses look really light, and the water looks really light. But the houses look light because they're surrounded by by a lot of things that are dark. If I am to fold the paper over, I don't know if you can see that, and compare the white of the house to the white of the paper, you can see that's a whole value darker than, you know, than the white of the sheet. So I know that I've got to put some color into my white areas. In fact, I even think that I'm a little light. So in that general area, and I'm not concerned, I'm not filling in, right? I'm not being a filler-inner right now up to my pencil line, because the stuff that's going to be around it is going to be so much darker in value that it won't matter. I got a dark tree in here, I got some darker mountains and some elements of the landscape. I'm going to roll that down, and I want some color into my water as well. Okay. I have I'm kind of stalling for time right now, right? I'm trying to think of what to say, but I'm not really stalling for time. I've got one eye on my sky. And remember I said a moment ago, I want that paper to be, when the shine just disappears, the second stage of moist. Right now, I can still see a shine in it. I don't know if you can see it from where you're sitting or on the screen, but it's still very shiny. And that means if I take a color, like what just happened right here, when I dropped that Payne's gray color, it just kind of spread out, it didn't stay put. When the paper goes to that next stage of wetness, moist, when I start to take a darker value for some of the elements of my clouds and stuff, it's going to stay put. And I can generate a good shape, and it won't bleed out. It will stay relatively the value that I put it in at, but it won't bleed and level off, which is what I don't want it to do. Now I'm going to mix up something for my clouds in the sky. You know, in painting, we watercolors have it hard, right? Not like those oil painters. They have it so easy. They can change their mind at any time in the process, right? We have to be. We have to be a little bit more clever than those oil painters. So we have to think about things like focal points or the point of the picture at the start. We can't just, like, you know, in oil painting, it kind of the focal point or the big idea of the painting kind of evolves, can involve in the course of the picture. But in watercolor, you really gotta think it out and plan it out, right? So I could make my houses be the focal point in the picture, or I could do something in the sky and make that the focal point. There's a saying in painting, you either feature the sky or feature the landscape, but you don't do both. So that means you make a very complicated sky with a very simple landscape, and vice versa. In this case, I'm going to try to put some complexity in my sky with the mist that's coming up and the parts of the. I got some mist coming off a mountain back in here, and I got some other stuff going on. I'm still stalling for time. You know, I'm taking a look at it right now. It seems this is like a really frustrating thing about watercolor. You have this part of the paper which is saturated, and this part of the paper is just perfect to go in there right now. And you got to kind of, and it seems that the center of the picture stays wetter longer, and then the edges dry fast. So we almost have to work from our edges down towards the middle. But whatever you do with the wet and wet technique, you never take when the paper begins to dry up a little bit and starts getting to that second stage of wetness. What you don't want to do is add more water to the paper, because that's what creates one of those nasty blooms that I understand a lot of people don't like. You know, those blooms are look like a big water stain on your picture. So we're getting good up here. It's just probably the right time to kind of hit that area. So I'm going to take some Payne's gray, cobalt blue, and ivory black, and I want to extract again the water out of my brush. By using a paper towel. Yeah, I'm removing some paint, but I'm mainly removing color, water. Now you can see, because the paper's at that nice stage of wetness, I'm getting a soft edge to my cloud forms, which is precisely what I want. Again, every time I reload the brush, I extract a little water out of it. It's so quiet.
It's so intriguing to watch.
Really?
Are you still mixing your greens by yourself and then
Oh, yeah.
putting in a new tub?
Yep. I'll talk about that in a little bit too.
Are you following your photograph?
I'm kind of inventing the sky a little bit. You know, and then I can take the paper and tilt it a little bit, right? And when I tilt it, you can see some lines going down, and that might look like rain. And if you want that effect, you just see how it's starting to form a line going down off my cloud. I don't know. If I don't want that, you go this way, and that softens out the forms a little bit, okay? And it looks less like it's, you know, in a line.
Do you always paint flat?
Yes. I don't know how people paint on an angle. Maybe at the end of the picture I do, but when I start like this, I'm always working flat. You can start to see this part of the picture as the paper's dried a little bit. I'm starting to get a line. So now I'm getting the ever-expanding cloud. All right, and then down in here, we're going to have an area where it's a little lighter than the rest, and here's another cloud form. And again, because the paper is moist, whenever I put this color in here, I'm getting a nice soft edge, a cloud-like feeling. Again, always from the palette, from the brush into a paper towel. And I don't want to bring more water onto my page, because at this stage, if I do that, you get a bloom, which is not going to be cool. Now I'm kind of pre-planning here a little bit. This is a lower level cloud, and it is touching a mountain that's going to be in this area later on. And I'll show you how I'll get that look. But I want to bring this cloud form down into my mountain area. Again, always go into the paper towel before I hit the paper. We this same day, later in the day, we were kind of heading away from sky and going to back into Pittenweem. This was a day that we were traveling, and our host for our bed and breakfast had suggested that one of the other places that we could visit was a place called Applecross. It sounds like a really pleasant name, right? And it was the most terrifying drive I've ever taken in my life. We got to the bottom of it, and all's great. We're seeing these, I guess they call them fairy pools. What a fairy pool is, it's a waterfall, a slowly cascading waterfall with little pools and stuff. And how beautiful it was. You know, that boggy, black soil, and then you got the green grass growing on top of it, and then a mountain that goes up into the clouds, right? And we stopped, and we were just walking around and enjoying the day, and then we decided to head on. Let's go see Applecross. So we drive, and we keep ascending into this mountain. And it gets getting higher and higher, and there's one lane road, right, everywhere, right, that both ways of the traffic share. And we could barely see maybe 100 feet ahead of us as we're driving. And then but I can look right, and there's nothing but our doom, you know, right off to the end. And I white knuckled it all the way, and but we never got to see anything. It all just looked like a white wall until we got out of the mountain and back to a lower level. when we got home, we Googled apple cross, and apparently it's on a lot of people's bucket lists to do this drive or to bike this thing. And we're looking at the thing, and my wife, we were sitting at the TV, our mouths are like, having done that ride, and there was a couple, they filmed it, and she's yelling at him for going too fast, and the whole thing, and we were just kind of going along, not oblivious to what was around us, but that was kind of cool. So there's going to be another cloud bank in here where the mist is coming off the mountain. It'll make more sense later when I get to it, but right now I'm kind of anticipating that I want to put this tone in that general area. You can kind of see how nicely it's beginning to dry. And I'm not messing around with the wash too much. As a teacher, when somebody tries this, I see it happen all the time. They just keep working the damn thing. They keep going into it and going into it. And John Pike, who wrote those books on watercolor, has a little passage in his book, and he said that on his wall in his studio where he teaches, he has this quote, and it says, working in watercolor is like telling a lie. The more you work on it, the worse it gets. And I could be standing here and just keep working in these clouds like some of my students do, and in the end, all they got is just a gray sky with nothing going on. They're not hanging onto the light spots. I hardly touch the paper at all, And I always think that's the key to making our watercolors look transparent. The less we work on them, the more beautiful they look, the more loose and labored they look. But the more we work into it, like John Pike says, the worse they get. Okay. Now, the other thing, so this is where some mist is going to come off my mountain. You'll see that later. I'm going to do the same thing in here, so I've anticipated that. I've got parts of my sky that are lighter than the rest. I always like to organize these whites in a way. I kind of oversimplified in my demonstrations, but that's a good thing, I think, so that you can kind of see where I'm thinking. I always like to have a little entrance point with the whites, right, or with the darks. But the viewer can feel as though they bring their eyes this way, and it brings them down to here, and then maybe back again. So I'm actually thrusting the viewer's eyes once, twice, 3 times down into my composition. And that really gives you the feeling of depth. So many times, I did this when I was learning, and when I'd see a sky like this, I would just make stripes going across a bunch of horizontal bands. And I really didn't realize the importance of putting things on an angle and how they help direct the eye down. And we can do the same thing on the bottom part of our landscape. There's an entry point in here where our eyes go this way, and then something else picks them up that way, and then back. And that's what makes your paintings visually stimulating, visually entertaining. And the viewer will want to continue to look at your picture because there's these nice rhythms. The next time you're at a museum and you're looking at a great landscape painter, and see what they did and how they organized it, you'll see that it's just not random. There's a lot of thought given to direction and these thrusts. And you can not only thrust it through the bottom part of your picture, but you thrust the eyes in with your sky, but you don't want to be obvious to the viewer that you're doing that to them. You want to subtly do this so they kind of look at your thing and kind of follow the eyes all the way around. Now, my paper's still very wet in the lake right now, and I want to do some wet in those areas. And even on my houses, I think they are kind of drying out. These white houses are kind of drying out a little too light as well. So now would be a good time to go over them a little bit with more color to darken the value up. And again, as I always do, when I work in wet paper, I load up the brush with the color that's the right value, test it out, and then I make sure there's not an excess amount of water in the brush and extract some of it, and then I can work into the paper. And if you're thinking that these houses are too dark, they're probably not. Once I start getting some of the elements around it later on, they will look a lot lighter in value. And then I want to get some, you might notice you'll see it chop in the water, or, the water is just not a simple surface. It's got multiple values in it. It might be a breeze going on it, or there's some chop in it. And I'm going to also, while the paper's damp down here, is I can introduce some of those texture into the water. And again, I could do this when it's dry, but it's nice to have that. I often think that the edges of it are more soft edged than hard, which is why I'm doing it now while it's wet and wet. And of course I can go over all the other elements of the landscape. How many times when we have a scene like this, do I see people stopping where the pencil line is and not thinking that they can go over an area which is going to eventually be so much darker in value, will have not noticed that you put this wash down. It's a step saver, but more importantly, it gets you thinking in a big way, or moving your arm in a big way, and not like this. We never want to paint that way. As long as the paper's wet, I got to change my mind here a little bit. Right behind this, which is going to eventually be an evergreen tree, I can throw more fog and mist back there. And because the paper's still at that moist stage, I can do this, and my wash dries all soft edged, and I get what looks like another layer to my sky. Okay. Before I go any further, I should be completely dry, so I'm going to hit the hair dryers.
Will it fit in here?
I have to switch the socket. Can I do that, or am I going to screw it up?
There's an extra.
Oh, is it an outlet there?
Yeah, it's right below your clip there.
Great. Oh.
Yeah.
See, I told you it was a long time since I used one of these things. I can't even plug them in. You know, when you use a hair, I don't like to use I don't really like to use a hair dryer when I paint, because thank you.
You're welcome.
Because you hit an area and you're not paying attention, and then all of a sudden you get a bloom because you're drying one area up before another area. So when you do use a hair dryer, evenly dry it. What I really ideally prefer to do is go take a coffee break at this point, and just let the thing dry on its own. But go slow, hold it at a distance so you're evenly drying the whole thing, and don't concentrate the heat on one spot. like watching paint dry, right? So I have a series of mountains that are behind our buildings and stuff in my landscape. And although, if you look at my reference, my photo reference, although they're full of green, lush vegetation, those mountains look blue, right? And why is that? It's the effects of the atmosphere on the landscape. The more moisture that's in the air, if this was a sunny day and it was really dry, those mountains would look very green because there's not a lot of obstruction of our ability to see the yellow in the landscape, right? And you will see more yellow in the landscape. But if there's moisture, dust, any kinds of particles in the air, they obscure our ability to see certain colors. One of the first colors that we can no longer see is yellow. And when you subtract yellow from green, what do you get? Blue, right? And that's why those mountains look so very blue. And then if it's really, really moist, like fog, it obscures our ability to see anything. And then everything gets just reduced down to, we don't even see the blue anymore, we just see more and more gray until eventually we can't see anything. And it's obscured by the prevailing atmosphere. So, part of the picture, you can see this mountain just beyond our houses in here. You can begin to see some green in the landscape. And we see more green along the base of the mountain because the base of the mountain's closer to us. The mountain goes up, it's further away. You'll see less green up at the top of the mountain and more towards the blue part of the color spectrum. So I'm going to take my Payne's Gray again. Payne's Gray that I mix, not the color that you buy. I have ivory black on the palette. Most people are surprised to hear that I have black on the palette. And in fact, if you went to art school, every art teacher I've ever had in my life at art school told me never to buy black, you know. But when I did my independent study, and I was where I really learned landscaping from a man named Arthur Maynard and John Osborne, they both had it on their palette. And then I started to look at artists that I admired, like Homer and John Singer Sargent, Andrew Zorn. They all had black on the palette, right? I think the art teachers at our school got lazy. They didn't want to people wrongly assume black goes into the shadow, and it doesn't. You don't want to put that, shadows go towards violet, not black. And I think they just didn't want to deal with students using black all the time. But God only knows what the reason was. But it's a perfectly useful color. And if you buy Payne's Gray, you are essentially using ivory black. So why not control what kind of blue you're using with your Payne's Gray? Because after all, Payne's Gray really isn't a color. Payne's Gray is an idea. It's a concept, right? Payne's Gray can either be more gray or it can be more blue, right? And then you want to be able to, if you're mixing your Payne's Gray, which the paint companies make, it's a Winsor blue. I know that's what Winsor & Newton does, which is a greenish blue. It's a cheap color. And so now all your Payne's Gray are going to have a greenish cast to it. They used to make it years ago with ultramarine, but when ultramarine got expensive, they started to use a cheap dye color, which is why they're using the phthalo blue today. But ideally, Payne's Gray, which is the, I said it's a concept, it's a shadow control outdoors, should be mixed with cobalt blue. Cobalt blue is true blue. There's no red in it, there's no violet in it, and there's no green in it. It is blue. And if you want to mix Payne's Gray, and then we want to have that freedom to put whatever we want into that color to make it green or red, or just to keep it a straight blue gray, just go back to the source, cobalt blue and ivory black, and you'll be better off. I'm going to mix up my Payne's Gray, and I'm going to keep it on the blue side this time, not on the gray side. So I've got my cobalt blue, and I'm going to add a little bit of ivory black to it.
Now, I can't see what you're doing. Are you mixing the pigment and then adding water, or are you?
I added some water here, and then to the water I added the pigment, and I have some cobalt blue right there wet. Now I'm taking a little bit of gray, and I'm adjusting the color accordingly. So I've got a bluish gray, which I think is good for the part of the picture that I'm going to use. Now we have a mountain that's beyond our landscape here that goes back into this area. And I want to work kind of quickly in this area. I don't want it to dry on me because I want to do something to the top part of the mountain as it touches the sky. The mist is lifting off. I have to be careful when I paint around my white buildings though. So I want to take my time around that. But on the other hand, I want to just keep an eye on this edge of the mountain, which I'm going to do something to in a moment for the fog effect, or the mist effect lifting off the mountain. I get a little break in here because I have an evergreen tree coming up, and I could just stop the wash right before I get to the evergreen tree. Now that top edge is nice and wet. Spin the paper upside down. I could even have it on a little bit of an angle this time. And I get a halftone brush. I'm selling halftone brushes later if anybody wants to buy. There's no such thing as a halftone brush. But I could have sold you one. Right? A halftone brush is just a brush full of clean water. And I'm making a nice soft edge for where this mountain kind of touches the sky. And because I pre-plan, and I want to not just end there, I want to keep taking this all the way to the top, and I can tip it a little so that the paint kind of goes down. But when you do that, here's what starts to happen. You see that little thing in here? That's an effect ruiner because the paint is pouring into that area. So I want to keep an eye on that. What I'm going to do, but I do want the hard edge in here. That's going to make it look like the mountain is not being hit with the fog, is I want to lift off some of the color out of there. And I keep taking like a damp brush this time, and I just keep wiping the brush into a paper towel. Sometimes, if you've ever seen a misty morning, you'll see like what looks like smoke coming off the mountain in a little area. It might be more moist in there for whatever reason. If you want to get that effect, take the brush full of clean water. I'm going to do it right here. Just hit some water into that area, and then just continue to wipe the brush into the paper towel. Right, and that edge keeps creeping back, so I just got to keep hitting it with some clean water and wiping my brush into the paper towel.
Was the sky pretty dry?
Totally dry.
Yeah.
Totally dry. And you don't want it to be even, a little dry. It has to be completely dry, otherwise you're going to get blooms all over the place, right? And then when you're satisfied that you got a nice soft edge coming off that mountain, leave it alone. Don't look at it funny, don't talk to it. Just kind of let it dry. All right, now we have the next mountain in this area, and we're starting to begin to see some green. It's a little closer to us. So now I could take my Payne's gray color and I could add a little yellow to it, or a little green to it. I'm just going to add a little tiny bit of it's not a tiny bit. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to it to make it slightly greenish. And by doing so, it'll look like our mountain is a little closer to us. I want a good shape around the form of it. And this one, because it's so close to us, it's not getting hit with the fog and that soft edge thing going on. And when I get around my buildings, I want to paint a nice careful shape around them. I like how in my photograph how you can start to see some boats in the distance or some land masses. And instead of like sitting here and trying to draw them out or using an art masking fluid, what I prefer to do is hold the brush almost parallel to the page. You see how I'm holding the brush now? And I'm dragging, the brush is level to the hairs of the brush are level to the page. And when I scrape like that, I get a broken edge look, and it begins to look like little houses without painting little houses, right?
Is that a flat or a round brush?
A flat. And now as we go left, or rather as we go right, my right, and up, the color goes more blue because of the effects of the atmosphere. So I'm going to add more blue and a little bit of ivory black. You know, I teach a class in Ridgewood, and I like to talk about food. My classes are really a food class that where we paint. It's been described as, honest to God, you know. But when I was in Scotland, they had a most amazing dish. It sounds awful, but it was really good. If you're ever there, get it. Called Colin's Skink. Isn't that an awful name? It was delicious. It was a chowder made from smoked haddock. And because they're not really noted for their food over there. But but if you're there, make sure you go to a pub and order that. It was really, I could have ate that all week, and I did.
What, no haggis?
Oh, of course not. Oh my God, I hate the whole concept of haggis. And then I'm going down into the mountain. This part of the mountain is going to be more hard-edged and on the Payne's Gray side. The people were lovely there. It really is a nice place. And again, I'm keeping my eye on that edge because I'm going to do the same thing like I did over there with the soft edge. And then again, I'm going to spin the paper around, get clean water in my brush, and create the lifting fog. You'll notice too that when you do this, you don't just walk away right now because you're going to leave a line right there. And it's going to kill your effect in the sky. So you really want to take this brush and just continue it so that wash goes into nothingness, right? It goes up into the white. And if I leave any bit of a line in here, the line's going to show up, and it's not going to, the effect is going to be ruined. So you know, if you have to grab a big brush, make sure it's loaded with some clean water, and just hit the edge of it and just try to bring, make that line disappear. And again, here's that corner thing going on. I don't care what really goes on in here. I actually kind of like it, and it makes the mountain look a little larger, but the ends look a little weird if you leave that line there. So just be careful to continue to lift off the corners here and here. My watercolors, I always like to make it look like a watercolor. So there's got to be a little effect in there. Like this kind of stuff is very unique to the medium, as is the stuff that we did wet in the sky. It's always nice to have feature a little effect that comes from working in this media. You can lift off maybe some more mist in here. Again, I bring a brush loaded with some paint, hit the area, lift off some of that paint. remember what I'm exposing too is those earlier washes of that sky that I put in there. I think that looks good. And I tied it in with that other mist coming up off earlier. There's just one little spot in here I want to just clean up. Okay. And then back to the foreground scene. John had mentioned earlier about my greens, and I do. I guess I'm kind of noted for it in watercolor. But my teacher's teacher was a man named Frank Vincent Dumont. Dumont was a French academically trained artist in the 1800s. You know, there was that book about was it Attenborough's book, The Greater Good? Is that the name of the book? But all these in the 1800s, a lot of the American-born artists, doctors, musicians, they all went to Europe. They were all
McCullough's book.
McCullough's book, yeah. The Greater Good, right?
I don't think so, but
Yeah. He writes about how all these musicians, artists, and doctors, they went to Europe, having been born here and never set foot there. They were blown away when they arrived in Paris, and how much it influenced. They all made this mecca to France, and likewise my teacher's teacher, Dumont, in the 1800s, went to the Académie Julian in Paris, where he studied with Bollinger, Lefebvre, all those French academic painters, and they can trace their lineage all the way back to Corot, you know, the great French landscape painter. And Dumont was noted for his greens, and he taught at the Art Students League for many years. They referred to him as the old man. He was probably more noted as a teacher than he was as an artist, and influenced a whole generation of artists that include Norman Rockwell, Ogden Pleiser, who was my personal favorite, George O'Keeffe, Marin. There was a lot of artists that he taught in New York, along with Frank Mason and Abrams, who was more contemporary painters. But anyway, when I worked in oils, when I was learning landscape painting, I learned about Dumont's greens, and we had mixed up a whole string of greens, just with combinations of yellow and blue. And you know, as all you artists know, how hard it is to work with green and how difficult it is to come up with a tube-bought green that doesn't look metallic, that looks vegetable looking. Dumont was, like I said, did have one show in his career, and the critic who reviewed it had said, you know, when they talk of Velázquez, they'll talk about Velázquez's use of black in his backgrounds, right? But when they talk of Dumont, they'll talk about his use of greens. It was very complimentary, high compliments, I'd say, to be compared to Velázquez. But his greens really are amazing. And the problem with Corot's greens, if you go to the Brooklyn Museum, you can see some of the French Impressionists there, like Harpigenes is another one. The colors over time, I went to in Williamstown, Mass. There's a museum up there, the Clark Museum. Thank you. And they have a whole bunch of Corot paintings. But the first time I saw it, I was wondering, why was Corot painting his trees black? And it wasn't that he was painting the trees black. The paint oxidized. It actually turned black over time. And curators and conservationists are struggling to try to prevent that from happening. But oxide of chromium was a color that he had used, which is a green that you can still buy today. I would never use it. It's it's really poisonous, first of all. And second, it turns black over time. But Dumont wanted to come up with a set of greens that would stand up to time, not fade or oxidize over time. So he started to use the cadmiums. And we went back to kindergarten, where we learned how to mix green in kindergarten, yellow and blue. And in order to pull off a light effect, if you want to make your landscapes look like they're full of sunlight, you put more yellow in them versus blue, and then on the shadow side, you put more blue versus yellow. And that's what I did in oils. And I learned, we had strung up a whole string of greens from our lightest values to our darkest values, like 10 different greens. We had them all in tubes, and they were very convenient as a landscape painter to squeeze out a little bit of green and knowing that you've got the right value, or the right color temperature for painting a particular light effect. And when I went back to watercolors, because I'm always a watercolor artist at heart, and and I know you all are, right? It's the whole point of this organization, right? Our love of this particular medium. I wanted to do that in watercolor, and I was doing it by eye, and I was doing a pretty good job. In fact, I once took a painting that I did outdoors, and I did cut them up into tiny little, squares, and took what I had mixed for the sunlight and held it up to my oil paints, and I was dead on. So I knew my eye was good, and I knew the colors that I was mixing in the palette were good. And I thought about it, and I wound up mixing 4 strings of green. And in watercolor, the value of the green depends on water. In oils, it was white paint. So I knew that I didn't have to mix up all 10. I could just get away with mixing these 4. And to make it simple to understand, is cadmium lemon yellow and French ultramarine blue. You mix more yellow if it's sunny out, and you mix it to the value of cad yellow deep, or below cad orange in value. And if you want a shadow value, add more blue, and you mix it to the value of cadmium red medium, which is about 2 values away, and you'll get a light effect, a sunny light effect. On an overcast day, I have a third green that I mixed up.
Joel, could you hold the palette under the camera?
Of course. I have to reload my colors, but can you all see it?
Yeah.
So here's my cadmium lemon, my ultramarine I have in 2 spots. I put the French ultramarine here, I put it also here. My whole palette is set up according to the colors of the visible spectrum. But here's cadmium lemon yellow, and then here's the ultramarine blue. And what I've done is I've added progressively more blue to get to my darker values. This is the value of the green in the sunlight, and I'll put a little swatch of it out so you can see what I'm talking about. This is what I would use for sunlight green, right? Nice and vegetable looking, right? And then for the shadow, I put more ultramarine blue in the mix, and I come up with that color. And you can see there's a nice jump between the two greens. And when done right and correctly and with a nice shape, you will get a nice jump between the two, and it will begin to look like sunlight. For the overcast day, like I'm painting now, the greens aren't as light. They're still as dark as that in the shadow, but the greens are a little darker than that, and they're bluer than that on an overcast day, because think about it, what's the light source on an overcast day? It's not the clear blue sky, it's the dark gray sky. That's the light source. So we mix more ultramarine into the color, and we get a value darker, and that's what I use and I'm making a generalization here. And of course, you could mix these greens up, and it will not paint a landscape for you, so it's not a formula. But it's a starting point, and it really makes it convenient when you've got so much to think about outdoors, and you're trying to make a good shape. You're trying to paint well, and you have to stop and think about what value you're mixing. I know that I got the value pretty correctly. And of course, there's variations on these colors. You can go out on any given day, especially this time of year. It's September, we're heading towards the autumn, and they're starting to see more, the colors begin to change in the trees a little bit. They're not as lush as they were in June, right? Or even in early May, when the buds are starting to pop out. When it's really that kind of a color, I use this color, which I put more phthalo in it, and I put a little bit more yellow in it, and that's a good green buds on a spring tree color to use, right? So there's variations to this, and this time of year, I'm probably to that color, I'm taking a little bit of like red or orange to the mix, and I'm browning out the color a little bit, so that it looks like we went through a whole hot summer and the foliage has browned up a little bit. So there's variations to it. And I confuse everybody about all this stuff. It sounds so very technical, right?
You have about 15 more minutes.
To this whole thing? Oh, geez, I better get moving. I could go on and on and on. You gotta stop me. Thanks for time. I'm gonna paint really fast now. I'm sorry. So anyway, I'm gonna use that overcast green that that I mixed earlier. That has more blue than yellow in it. I got 15 minutes. That's it.
Why do you use French ultramarine to make your greens and not cobalt blue?
Cobalt's a little lighter. There's some violet in the ultramarine. It's darker than the cobalt in value. Okay, so now I've got my green mixed up. I'm going to add a little tiny bit of red to it to gray it out. But don't overshoot it. You'll wind up with a brown tree, and I don't think you want to do that. Then I have to do a little bit of negative painting in here. There's some houses back into the distance, and again, I'm going to just scrape the brushing away. That leaves little gaps here and there. And if I do it right, it begins to look like a house that I intentionally painted, but I didn't really intentionally paint it. I'm trying to bring some of the landscape into the houses and stuff. Obviously, I'm leaving white where the buildings are white, but it would also be nice just for the lost edge to take some of this color, you know, and perhaps bring it right into a roof for the lost edge, so you kind of can't tell where the landscape ends and a building begins. If you paint everything also separate, they begin to look cut and pasted, and that's not cool. I don't mean cool color temperature, I mean cool, you know. You can bring a window down. You know, please don't paint a smiley face on your buildings like I'm gonna do, right? And then you put a little mouth there, right? You know, when you do a cluster of houses like that, you just really got to pay attention to the ones that are in the front, and the back ones can just be handled with this, you know, some, you know, abstractly with just a couple of rectangles or triangles back there. But one house should be pretty well drawn out, and all the rest will look good. It's like doing a, you know, a grouping of cows. Whenever I'm on a farm and I paint a cluster of cows, I just make sure that the ones in the front are more well drawn than the ones going back.
See if I can zoom in a little bit there.
And then I got this tree, which I was promising you was a little break in my in my painting earlier, right? But now I can go very dark on it and cover up all those lines that were created from where I stopped. Early on in my education, I would have carefully drawn out this particular tree, and then when I got to painting it, I would have carefully filled it in, you know. And I realized what a waste of energy it was, right? To do something like that when I know it's going to be so considerably darker, I can go over stuff, and then no one will ever know that I stopped there. That was a big moment for me. And then we're going down into the foreground. to all that wonderful seaweed, which I can never figure out how to mix. It always baffles me. Sometimes it looks, so orange. I put so much orange in it, and then I take it home, it looks awful. I never quite know what to mix in here. I do have some dirt on the, or rock, below this area that I'm putting in now.
Is that low tide again?
Yes. And to get that rock color, that brown tone, there's no brown in my palette, by the way. Did you notice? I mix browns through combinations of black and my colors. And I don't think of brown when I mix. I look at a color. To me, this legend here looks on the reddish. It looks brown. You might say, "Oh, it's brown." I could mix that with burnt sienna or whatever. I look at that now. I see the pure color in it, and to me, it's red. It's grayed out red. But obviously, it's not red, but it's in the red. You can't see it. It just looks black to you, probably, right? But there's some red in there. Okay, and I know it's an overcast day, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a cadmium red deep, and I'm going to take some blue, ultramarine blue, and I add a little black to it, and lo and behold, there's your brown, but it's a color I mixed. Right? It's not out of the tube. And there's some principle behind it. Right? Some blue in it for the overcast day.
Oh.
And then when it meets where it meets the ground, there's some lighter rock. Again, because it's an overcast day, I throw some blue into it. So I've got a light blue-gray. Well, actually, it looks more red. I probably had some red in the brush left over. Let me try that again. So I grab some of the Payne's gray. This will be for some of the lighter rock in the front. Can you all see? Is that on the position right? Yep. No. I'm using a flat brush. Now notice how I'm holding the brush. Sometimes I'm holding the brush flat to the page, and when I scrape, I get that broken edge look. Sometimes I hold the brush straight up and down to fill in the area solidly. I'm always aware of the position of the brush for a desired effect. We get some a field in front of that. Do a little color switch. How am I going to make it?
10 minutes.
Good. All right, and then we're going into some of the seaweed now. I'm going to intentionally leave little openings in the front here for a tide pool, right? Tide goes out and leaves a little water behind. Those little tide pools are really kind of cool. There was a, mentioned Arthur Maynard was one of my teachers, and his childhood teacher was a man named Anthony Teamy, who was a Rockport artist. And Teamy was noted for his street scenes. And he would always leave a little puddle in the, they say he would run out after the rain and take his easel out and set up and paint the puddles in the street. The beauty about a puddle is that when I put a couple in here, when the viewer sees it, they immediately look up to see where the reflection's coming from. And you get this vertical eye movement from the viewer, which is a good thing. It's a hard thing to normally get. Normally the viewer meanders through like a Z. But when you get that vertical from, and that's often created from and he was aware of that, Teamy. You get that wonderful vertical eye movement. Now I'm trying to paint a nice shape. This is why I love low tide. I love the edges that the seaweed or rock or whatever's in the water makes against that. And remember earlier, I threw my color in for the ocean, so I don't have to do it now, right? It's done already. I could probably go back into later on and texture it again, but I don't have to. It's well masked.
If you go back in, would you wet it again? Or?
No, I would just go, I don't think the whole thing has to be made any darker, so I don't have to do that. But what I would want to do would be to maybe throw some texture on top of it, and I would probably do it in a dry brush in isolated areas. What I skip all through the foreground begins to look like little puddles all over the place. But I don't want to make my foreground, I don't want to make it busy. So I really got to be selective. I got to paint the major openings and disregard the minor. And if I do put a lot of texture in there, organize it in a way that it helps the composition, leads the eye through the painting. Are you going to do a 2-minute clock on me? No? It's football season. I kind of looking at this thing and I kind of like the way that, I got some hard edges in there, but I kind of like the way that, that was an accident, right? A little happy accident.
So this brown in the foreground, you just added more yellow?
I'm adding yellow, orange to it. Like I said before, I really never know how to mix that color. And I swear when I'm on location, it looks orange and it looks green. But you know what I am doing? I don't know if you're aware of it, but I've thrown multiple colors into this area, haven't I? I introduced a little bit of blue into here, and then I got the color actually transitions from, a greenish blue to the yellow, back to a gray. There was nothing deader in picture making than the same color throughout. And there's nothing more lively than a color that has transition and changes, right, in a particular wash. Any one of these colors just isolated would have been horrible over the whole foreground. Because I mixed it up so much, it looks good. Another thing that I've been doing lately, I hate gimmicks. But sometimes I like to sprinkle a little bit of water into the wet wash to get a lighter value into my light area. You can use, I know some people use those spray bottles and they mist it on here and they get some little lighter areas throughout. And that's kind of the same thought. But I don't overdo that. But when done right, it looks pretty good. It looks like I got another value within my my landscape. Two minutes?
5.
5? Okay. Whew. Now I'm all messed up. Now I gotta talk for 5 minutes because I. And the other thing that you want to do in the immediate foreground, I'm also gonna. These little lines in the water sometimes are useful too to help. Remember I said earlier about thrusting the eyes through a composition at least 3 times. I could set some of this little areas where there's exposed rock or seaweed, and I can organize them in a way that they help lead the eye back into here. And then, you put a couple of these lines going across for some floating seaweed, right? And that's enough floating seaweed, but I want to bring the viewer sees that they follow it out here, and they keep going and they go on to the next painting on the wall, and I want them to ever do that.
what's gonna happen with the white buildings?
And
Is
then
there
I would add a little,
more detail?
I would add a little bit more, knock a window here and there. Try not to do a little smiley face, right? But now I might pick up the direction going back the other way. Right, with some, maybe this is some texture in the water, a wake in the water, or breeze. Maybe that's a little dark, but you get the point. And so the eyes follow that and they go back, going back that way. When the foreground dries, it'd be nice to get a super dark somewhere in the foreground to help set the whole distance up in my painting. And for that, to get that accent value, you take cadmium red deep and some ultramarine blue, and you mix up a color that it's a really dark purple, but it looks like black. That's how dark it is. But it's not black, it's a dark violet. And somewhere in the foreground, under a rock or something, or a pebble, or just a cluster of seaweed, try to get it dark in the immediate foreground. And that dark helps set up the whole distance in the painting. And that is it. Okay.